Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Janae Tibshirani and today I'm back with the BNZ Chair in Business in Asia at Victoria University, Professor Siah Hwee. Thank you for joining us, Siah.
Good to see you, Janae.
It's been a big week in Asian politics. The Philippines has somewhat dramatically announced its separation from the US, declaring it is realigning itself with China. The Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte says the two countries will resolve their dispute in the South China Sea through talks. His call comes further to China causing outrage around the world by saying it would ignore a ruling made in The Hague, supporting the Philippines in finding Beijing doesn't have historic rights to the sought-after trade route. The Philippines' new relationship with China has also been sealed with a $13.5 billion bunch of trade deals. So yeah, how is this new realignment in Asia going to change the balance of power?
No, it's going to be an interesting development there because, we actually know that when the Philippine president took up his appointment, straight away he has been crystal clear that there's a need to talk about economic terms with China, right? And part of the challenge around South China Sea, may I remind some of those people, is that basically, in the South China Sea, we are not really talking about the sea per se, we are talking about the One Belt, One Road, right? So now we resonate, One Belt, One Road with China, and that's normal because I think China is relying on the One Belt, One Road for its own growth, so it needs to go past the South China Sea, and from the Chinese perspective, yes, right, it's actually great to solve some problems around the South China Sea, right? If the Philippines is up for it, then of course that's the ideal state, right? So for one of the first time this time round is basically that we realize that economics power is actually stronger than the political powers behind it, right? And initially, the South China Sea goes into a battle of political struggles between the nations, Southeast Asian nations and China, but now it's the set of countries are actually coming to terms and actually talking to each other in terms of economic terms, and henceforth that kind of deal. Right, in terms of the effect that is actually going to transpire that comes out of it is that basically what we might actually see is more activities around the One Belt, One Road in the Southeast Asia region. That's what it is.
Okay. Yeah. Do you think we might see other countries in Asia sort of more explicitly, in the same way that the Philippines has done, jump on board with China and kind of make that call and say, look, America, we're ditching you, we're joining up with China in such a sort of explicit way?
It will be very unusual, right? Given that the United States is the largest trading partner for Philippines, to be honest, I have no idea why he has to be, that upfront. But I presume he's basically trying to say, look, we are ready to burn the bridges, right? And publicly, he's already reiterate that he actually, in order to gain the trust of the Chinese, right, you have to actually start to distance yourself from the Americans, and that he has actually said that in public as well. So it's in the news as well, in some other medias as well. So it's important to recognize that he's actually pushing very hard to try to gain the trust in a very sort of dramatic, very quick way without actually spending the time to actually gain the trust, because that kind of regaining trust is actually will take a long time. Yes. Right? He's not having that patience to do it, so he's going to do that in a dramatic way, but I doubt any countries in that region will do the same. They will probably be a bit more cautious to be saying that, look, let's actually just have the bridges all burned and straight away say we are all aligning to China and then just ditch the US. I doubt that will actually happen. But I think it's because you start from -5, you have to go yourself into 0, right? So you have to actually work harder.
Sure. Something else quite inflammatory that the Philippines president has said, he sort of said that the Philippines is going to jump on board with Russia, and it's going to be Russia, China and the Philippines against the West. He's once again used quite strong language around that. Should we be concerned about that in New Zealand, given we are so close to that region?
I think when he said things like this, it was a bit dramatic as well. I mean, you try to jump on with China and Russia, and to be honest, between you and me, I mean, in general, what we actually see, right, is that Russia and China don't necessarily like each other either, right? It's never easy going to be jumping on the ship with these other two, when these other two are not necessarily on the same page all the time, right? So I think it's a bit of a far-fetched kind of statements, and I doubt there shouldn't be any worry about that. If there's anything think it's more like if the Philippines is working closer with the Chinese and the Chinese are working closer with the Russians, or the Russians are working closely with the Philippines, it's more likely to be bilaterals as opposed to, okay, let's jump in as a group.
Okay.
Right, and creating havoc in that space. I doubt that will happen.
Okay, so you're talking about the South China Sea. Gerry Brownlee recently came out and spoke out against China and the fact that it was ignoring this ruling by The Hague. Do you think that was a good call?
In terms of Chinese ruling around
Or do you think it was a good idea for Gerry Brownlee when he was visiting in Beijing to actually make that call?
I think it's really more or less stating the fact, right? The fact is that China just can't see why the tribunal, right, which is supposed to be run by God knows who, basically decides that China should not do what it's doing, right? And in China's terms, I think it's less about who owns that area, it's about actually activities needs to happen. Right, and it again goes back to my issues around, that one belt, one road that they have. You speak to Chinese, they will tell you about one belt, one road. They don't really talk to you about free trade agreements as much as they do anymore. Okay. Right, they talk to you about one belt, one road, and that's because the one belt, one road, in particular, the one road goes past the South China Sea. Right, so it's becoming a huge issue there, because nothing is growing in that space, right? Trade with ASEAN is down as a result of that kind of engagement with ASEAN. So there's been issues around how do those ships actually go past this region all the way to the Straits of Malacca, Indian Ocean, all the way, to the Red Sea and so on, right? So there are challenges, right, for the Chinese, and it's the first time they have been so aggressive in public to say things like, okay, we totally disagree with the world order, and by the way, what is the world order? What does that mean, right?
Yeah, actually, I was quite surprised to see that China's ambassador to New Zealand spoke on The Nation a couple of months ago, and it was just unusual, I guess, from a New Zealand perspective, to see a political figure speak so abruptly. I mean, we watch political shows here and we don't see such strong language. I think it's interesting. Anyway, look, see, closer to home, this week Finance Minister Bill English has been accused of bowing to China's interests by cancelling a meeting that had been arranged with some high-level Hong Kong officials at the last minute. And Bill English has released a statement saying that he'd received advice from MFAT saying he should call the meeting off. But David Shearer from the Labour Party and also the Green Party, they are meeting with these officials, and they have also met with officials from Australia and the US. So the pair are Anson Chan, who was head of the Hong Kong Civil Service during the island's transition from the British to Chinese control, and also the political activist Martin Lee. So Bill English pulls the plug on this meeting at the last minute. How do you think he should have handled it?
Well, I mean, there are two things that could have potentially not happened or happened, right? So the first thing first, right? I mean, it will be very awkward to say that you have actually committed yourself to a meeting with these two officials from Hong Kong and at the last minute change it, right? It creates a bad impression on the side of New Zealand, right? To say why is these people undecided, and even on the side of China, to say that China is actually putting a lot of pressure on Bill English or whoever that he represents, right? So I think it's actually not good in the sense that it was first agreed and then accidentally cancelled, right? Is if you agreed it, then you should have just met them and listened, and just in some ways, if you don't think you want to actually align with their democratic thinking around Hong Kong from China, right? It's a easy way to just say publicly we are actually not acknowledging that, we're just listening. Listening here doesn't hurt. Right. At the same time, of course, initially one can fall back and ask the question, right? His office shouldn't even have agreed to actually say, it's okay to meet Bill English. I think it's ideally not to do it, because at the end of the day, the MFAT advice is probably advisable, because if we think about right, we actually formally recognize Hong Kong as part of China, we have to be careful here, because we are talking about domestic affairs in China. right? So if they want us to get involved in the domestic affairs in China, as in Hong Kong wants to get us involved in the domestic affairs of China, we have to understand what China thinks, right? So just to give you an example, say if Auckland one of these days becomes a very high growth economy on its own and decided to ditch the rest of the rest of New Zealand, right? What is the question to be asked if the Auckland mayor goes to Australia and asks the question, can you support us to be democratic and distance ourselves from New Zealand? What would the New Zealand government say, right? Of course, they will say, look, you are not actually part of us, so why should you be talking to the Auckland mayor about, Auckland being distanced away from the rest of New Zealand? Now, we are facing that kind of situation here because Hong Kong is officially classified as part of China, and it's actually a domestic home matters to which we have to be carefully dealing with this when we actually talk to them about democratic society, because we know that is a communist country.
Do you think China is more sensitive to these sorts of issues than other countries might be?
China will be very sensitive, so they will be watching like who they are talking to and this and that. So I mean, in some ways, they'll say yes to meet them and then say no. It's not a bad thing, but at the same time, it actually creates that kind of uncertainty around the New Zealand is undecided, or an uncertainty around maybe China is putting too much pressure. So it's a lot of this kind of misunderstanding, I would say, right, that should not have happened if people just be more sensitive around, handling this kind of issues.
Winston Peters has come out and perhaps quite emphatically and said that's just classic New Zealand's bowing to China, doing what they say, and has really slated the government for doing that. Do you think there's any rationale to that view that Winston Peters has voiced? Well,
unless there's belief that there's a phone call from China to Bill and say, look, or to MFED and say, you should not talk to these two, right? If not, it becomes inference, right? Inference or assumption that has happened. But no doubt, China is actually having a lot of implicit, silent pressure on every country in the world. And it's not just New Zealand, right? It's like the Philippines, right? We have just been talking about the Philippines saying that, look, don't worry about the Americans, let's deal with the Chinese, right? So again, it's the kind of pressure, right, that economically, Asian countries and in particular China is going to have a lot more influence in the world economic growth, and we have to recognize that, and because of that, they have a lot more power and say and implicit influence. It may not be explicit, it won't be like a phone call to MFED and say, you better tell your finance minister not to talk to them. It's probably more like, well, let's try to be careful here not to actually in some ways piss off the Chinese. So implicitly there is some influence, but it's not like there was a phone call that threatened.
So soft power.
Soft power kind of thing that's actually going on behind the back that we have to be sensitive. We know they are very sensitive because there are more than one region in China that wants to be distanced away from the core, right? We know that, right, in the west side of China in particular. So there is a lot of work in the Chinese government space to try to hold the country together, right? And bits and pieces are trying to actually leave the country, as in leave the core. So they are very sensitive towards that. If one happens, the rest will follow.
Sure.
So they will never let it happen, right? And for the same reason, they are very sensitive towards this kind of engagement.
Okay, Siah, look, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. It's always interesting to hear a different perspective on matters in Asia, and China particularly, and how New Zealand fits into that. So appreciate your time.
Thanks, Dini.
Thank you. And I'm Janae Tibshirani from interest.co.nz.